The shogunate forces was of course continuing to attempt to strengthen its armies at this time, but it wasn't quite working. At first, it raised militias in and around both Edo and Osaka as police-like forces, but the second they attempted to absorb them into the shogunal armies, these men usually left. Many of these villages harbored ronin and wanted to form their militias away from government supervision. In July of 1867 in Nagasaki, the magistrate, also known as Bugyo, began to make arrests of Christians. They had started to refuse Buddhist burials and even refused to keep their names within the temples. By October, the magistrate had arrested about 80 of these Christians. Many of these people were forced to apostatize, and of course, other tortures happened as well. And despite the fact that other powers would try and step in, it actually didn't stop the persecutions. The Christians in question were claiming freedom of religion, but it's much more complicated than that. They resisted all authority as well. The magistrate and even the village leaders were not listened to. Their stubbornness towards authority started to draw attention from the outside, such as Sakamoto Ryoma, the revolutionary samurai from Tosa. He thought that these Christians might be perfect to use against the government. Sakamoto, though, really didn't understand the religion, though, and only thought of them as a force to sway politics, something that one of his close friends would mention to him. Also, that this change of regime wasn't about religion and could only muddy things, so they were left on their own. Around September 20th, another disturbance happened, this time at Nagoya. There was a rather crazy rumor being spread that amulets were falling from heaven. The town citizens freaked out and started to flood the streets. They started dancing, singing, and drinking. Several of them started to break into houses, stealing and breaking everything that they could lay their hands on. Funny enough, though, this didn't seem to cause a lot of outrage. Instead, many were greeted with more song and dance. This insanity spread to neighboring Osaka, Kyoto, Shizuoka, Yokohama, Edo, and continued on into the winter, where it then stopped due to it just being too cold to continue. Now, despite this madness, Yamanouchi Toyoshige on October 29th handed the shogun Yoshinobu a document that suggested that a new regime was needed. The shogunate would end and be replaced by a parliament that would then set up in Kyoto. Toyoshige's plan was to have Yoshinobu to reside over the new government under the emperor's authority. It should be noted, though, that while Toyoshige, the lord of Tosa, was discussing these changes, Satsuma was marching men to Choshu. They had entered into a pact on the 16th, and the province of Hiroshima entered into the pact soon after, and would reach there at the beginning of November. Officials from these three provinces were meeting within Kyoto on what their next course of action would be. Iwakura Tomomi, the liaison between the court and the imperial movement, was also trying to get an official order to end the shogunate. Three of the court nobles, including Nakayama Tadayasu and, the emperor's father-in-law, signed this order in secret on November 8th. This was told to both Satsuma and Chosu, though the emperor's seal was not obtained. The same day, Yoshinobu signed the deed giving back political power to the emperor. He also said that all the problems within the empire were his responsibility. He also promised to let others in on discussions on how to protect Japan. It's true, though, that this really didn't have any political meaning. While he was technically returning power to the emperor, he was still going to act as the head of the government. Just this time with more people to help him in his work. Plus, considering that he was taking Toyoshige's advice, he was positive now that he would receive his support and the rest of the civil nobility. And they were actually quite delighted at the shogun's submission. Even the three nobles that had signed the secret order were actually quite happy. During November 15th, Yoshinobu's surrender of political power to the emperor was known in Edo. The Roju, or elders, residing there were shocked, and on the 16th the news was published through the daimyo and officials within Edo, and their reactions were mixed. Some felt that this was smart, and in the same time things would balance out. Others, that Yoshinobu was dishonoring the memory of his Tokugawa predecessors, and there were some that called for war against Satsuma and Chosu. On the 28th, Mochitsugu of Wakayama summoned all the daimyo close to the Tokugawa and their representatives, and told them that he was going to give up all his titles that he had received from the Imperial Court, so that he could work solely for the Tokugawa. In December, a few daimyo surrendered their titles to the Imperial Court, and the Shogunal Council sent part of the modernized army to Osaka. The Imperial Court refused to accept these surrenderings of titles, and Yoshinobu went in person to explain premature military action would actually damage what power he still had. For the new parliament to be formed, Yoshinobu called the daimyo to meetings several times during November. Few did, though. The ones that did show up were Matsudaira Yoshinaga, Tokugawa Yoshikatsu, and Naonori, Sano Mochikoto, and Shimizu Mochihisa, the son of Hisamitsu. The daimyo of Tosa and Chosu were absent, meaning that the only real opposition would come from Mochihisa of Satsuma. The Imperial Reformists, that being Saigo Takamori, Komatsu Tadawake, and Okubo Tochimichi from Satsuma, understood that if this was allowed to continue, the Imperial Court's opinion on Yoshinobu might change, as it already currently was, and the secret order to fight from within the Imperial Court on November 8th would also change. They left Kyoto to return to their provinces to prepare for a new strategy. They would, on their way back to Kagoshima, visit the Mori of Chosu. After this, they entered into Kagoshima and parted ways. Komatsu became sick and stayed there. Saigo also stayed behind to gather an army to accompany Shimizu Mochihisa to Kyoto, and Okubo went to Tosa to meet with Goto Shojiro. Tosa is an interesting province politically. They had made an agreement previously with Satsuma to bring about Yoshinobu's surrender of political power, which he had. So now Tosa didn't technically have an agreement with Satsuma anymore. Okubo's mission there was to get Goto's assurance that Tosa would help Satsuma form a new government. Goto Shojiro wasn't really interested in a civil war, so he agreed only on a basic agreement. Okubo didn't quite get the answer he was looking for, so he headed for Kyoto and got there on December 18th. Real quick, on the 10th of December, Sakamoto Ryoma and Nakaoka Shintaro of Tosa were both killed in Kyoto. Their killers were sent by the shogunal police. I just wanted to mention this real quick. Anyways, on the 18th, Shimizu Mochihisa and his army of 3,000 entered the capital with Saigo Takamori as the commander. A few days after, Asano Mochikoto came with around 300 men, and the Chosu army of 2,500 men marched and settled around the vicinity of Osaka. The Imperial Reformists were now ready for their coup. Okubo Tochimichi would organize the communication between Iwakura Tomomi, who was to represent the Imperial Court, and Saigo Takamori, who was to represent the Reformists. On December 26th, the three men went to make sure that they were on the same page as to what would happen next. Both Saigo and Okubo would then try to get Goto to have the Tosa province support him. His response was that his lord Yamanouchi would support them if they chose to wait until January 2nd. They would decide that they would do it on the 3rd. Goto Shojiro, then through Matsudaira Yoshinaga, would tell Yoshinobu, who was comforted that Tosa was assuring him that they were not going to abandon him. On the 1st of January, they told Tomomi that the plan was to, basically go through on the 3rd. On the 2nd, the civil nobles and the daimyo were summoned by the imperial palace. Yoshinobu, though, would decline the request, saying that he was sick, and everyone that worked for the shogunate actually did the same. Tokugawa Yoshikatsu Matsudaira Yoshinaga and Asano Mochikoto did actually go to the palace, and the other daimyo had officials sent to represent them. After a full day of deliberation, it was announced on the morning of the 3rd that they had made 3 decisions. The Mori of Chosu were pardoned and all titles restored. Nobles that had been exiled since 1863 would be pardoned and rehabilitated, and nobles that supported the shogunate would now have to forfeit their offices. The 3,000-man army from Satsuma then surrounded the imperial palace. At first, Saigo Takamori was worried if the Aizu troops, who had fought with Satsuma against the rebels before and were stationed there, would fire upon his men. They didn't. Instead, they evacuated their positions. Shimazu Mochihisa would then enter into the palace. Toyoshige of Tosa also showed, but he took his time doing so, which concerned Saigo quite a bit. He didn't fully understand that Toyoshige was worried that this coup would be directed towards the shogun personally. And Toyoshige's stalling was his way of preventing that. By the way, when I say stalling, I mean him and his men were about 4 hours late to everything. A second meeting with the civil nobles and daimyo then happened again within the palace. The conclusion was one you've already suspected. The shogunate was officially over, and the imperial monarchy was now to be restored. The first half of January would be spent creating this new government. But we'll cover that in the next episode. Make sure you slash that like button to support the channel. And if you haven't already, watch this video on the Chosu militia known as the Kihitai, Japan's first modernized soldiers. See you there.